Hello and welcome to Quadriga. We broadcast as the Munich Security Conference gets underway at what the conference's chairman is referring to as an historical inflection point, the most volatile period, in his view, since the Second World War. And a key aspect of that volatility is new doubt about the U.S. commitment to the international security order. How to interpret President Trump's America First policy was a key issue as NATO defense ministers met this week in Brussels. Many Europeans fear the U.S. could be preparing to turn its back on its traditional NATO allies, and that Washington's policy could play into the hands of Russian President Putin and wind up inadvertently benefiting China. America First, a threat to the world order? That's the question posed by our title this week, and we're going to pose it to three guests who've been following the subject very closely. Malte Karnitschnig is the chief correspondent for the European issue of Politico, and he says Europe is too weak and divided to fend for itself. It should do everything it can to safeguard the relationship with Washington. Shi Ming is a journalist from Beijing who has lived in Berlin for some years. He says there won't be any clear-cut showdown between China and the U.S. over the Pacific region. Instead, we'll see countless agonizing quarrels. And Malte Lehming is with us once again. He's a senior opinion editor at the Tagesspiegel, the German newspaper. He says it is still not clear what Trump's foreign policy priorities are, but strengthening NATO and committing the U.S. president to the rule of law are the best strategies for now. So, Malte Karnitschnig, President Trump has now been in office just about 4 weeks, 4 very tumultuous weeks. In that amount of time, he has offended long-term U.S. friends like Australia and neighbors like Mexico. He has issued ominous warnings to Iran and China and made highly contradictory pronouncements on Russia and Israel. So how do you read these signals, and how much do you think the new U.S. government does, in fact, represent an outright disruption to the international order?
Well, I think there definitely is a disruption. The question is, what will this mean in the long term for the U.S.'s relationships with Europe and with other countries and for the world order? And we don't really know right now. There's certainly a sense of drift. There are going to be investigations now in the U.S., it sounds like, into the new administration's ties to Russia. That could make it more difficult for Trump to try and forge some kind of new arrangement with Vladimir Putin to try and take on China, which is something that he clearly had planned to do before he came into office. So the events, as you sketched out, are just kind of moving so fast that it's very difficult to say what is going to happen and what the policy is going to be, especially when it comes to issues like NATO, when it comes to issues like China and terrorism and so on.
Let's nonetheless try to read a few tea leaves. Malte Lehming, you also said very mixed signals that we have been hearing. They shift from day to day, perhaps in no small part because Donald Trump apparently likes to have competing centers of power around him and purposefully set up his cabinet and advisors that way. So tell me, the resignation of the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, accused of overly close contact with Russia, does that perhaps represent the waning of that particular power center of the rather unconventional pro-Russian group?
I wish I could be more precise and straightforward than Matthew is, but it's so hard to interpret all these mixed signals. Now, I'm afraid maybe Donald Trump has different power centers in himself, because does he want to have a good new relationship with Putin? No one really knows. Good relationship with China, nobody really knows. Is he in favor or against the two-state solution? Nobody really knows. There are so many conflicting, not just conflicting, but contradictory elements in his rhetoric, that it's very hard to predict his motivations and outcomes. He certainly wants to provoke what he's calling the establishment. Still, he did that in his election campaign, and he's still doing this as a president with his tweets, with his rhetoric, with all these things. But I think this is due to his desire to please his constituency, or what he believes to be his constituency, because this was the main motivations for many Americans to vote for him. So this is still in the phase of his presidency when he still wants to provoke and not sending a clear, coherent foreign policy agenda.
Shi Ming, what is your take and what are you hearing from sources in China about the various revelations that we've heard about close contacts between Russia and not only Michael Flynn, the national security advisor who stepped down, but apparently also other members of Donald Trump's close team? What's your interpretation of that?
I think on the one hand, Chinese government shows a little bit, let me say, happiness that this American government does not prove as strong as it should be. We are glad to see that Donald Trump is facing more difficulties as he would like to show. But on the other hand, a quite unpleasant feeling is now upcoming, because this issue with the Security Council shows that Donald Trump is looking for secret connections over business. And there are so many Chinese businessmen, businesswomen looking for connections with all the secret councils or high-ranking officers around Trump. Maybe in some time soon there will be another affair, but this time not because of unpleasant ties to Russia, but because of unpleasant ties to China. I think the Chinese politics are somehow bothered with such kind of news. It is not clear that we all are glad to see, and we are not sure whether Trump is going to get even harder, even tougher because of these difficulties. He could distract even more attention if he succeeded in making China convincingly to his main enemy.
I want to come back to that point a bit later. But the idea that we just heard from Shi Ming, that the very business-oriented nature of Mr. Trump's view of the world, Matthew Karnitschnig, that could actually make his administration vulnerable to extortion, to corruption. Is that also one of the security risks, in fact, that this Trump, the new government entails?
Absolutely, and I think that you've also seen that in recent days, just the way that he deals with people, the way he deals with foreign visitors. When the Japanese Prime Minister Abe was visiting him at his sort of weekend residence in Florida, and they were discussing North Korea, and then it turned out that they were sort of looking at secret documents with the flashlight of a mobile phone, at this outdoor restaurant where there are all kinds of guests, and there was a wedding party going on, and there's all this stuff going on. It's clearly somebody who is not, comfortable in dealing in sort of the usual confines of government, and that is definitely a danger to national security in the long term. And I think the other tendency that we've seen since Trump came into office is that we in the press are always trying to kind of figure out what the actual plan is behind this. As you said, there are these power centers, and he likes to play people off, a little bit like Abraham Lincoln, this sort of team of rivals idea.
First time I've heard Donald Trump compared to Abraham Lincoln.
But I'm beginning to think that there really isn't any method to the madness. There is just madness, and it comes out in the tweets. This is another thing where people, the former U.S. ambassador to Germany said during his farewell speech, he said, "Oh, don't pay attention to the tweets. This is just part of his strategy to distract people from things he doesn't want you to talk about." And I'm not really sure that's the case anymore.
The big danger, I would say, the big question right now is what is the greatest danger? Is it a more or less dysfunctional, chaotic Washington White House system, which scandals almost every day, which is so weak that it cannot implement his policy? Is that a bigger danger than a functional White House, which could implement a maybe policy that we don't like? So what in security terms, this is right now the alternative we have to face, and it's a very, very hard question to answer.
And I think that's exactly what a lot of his opponents are hoping, is that these scandals will weaken his administration so much that it becomes paralyzed, that they're just dealing with all of these internal scandals and defending themselves.
But there is a danger coming out of a paralyzed, dysfunctional White House and Washington government.
Absolutely.
Let me take us back to the issue raised in the very first report that we saw in our program, namely security policy, because in fact we do meet as that Munich Security Council conference is getting underway. Its title this year is Post-Truth, Post-West, Post-Order. And on the way to Munich, the new U.S. defense minister appeared to defend the current order, at least in part, as he met with his NATO counterparts.
The alliance remains a fundamental bedrock for the United States and for all the transatlantic community, bonded as we are together. As President Trump has stated, he has strong support for NATO. It's a fair demand that all who benefit from the best defense in the world carry their proportionate share of the necessary cost to defend freedom.
So I want to ask in just a moment how all of you parse those remarks by Defense Secretary Mattis. But first, let's take a look at what NATO has been up to lately.
NATO maneuvers in Poland. The exercises are meant to show that NATO will defend its eastern member states against any Russian aggression. But how much protection can Poland, plus Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, actually expect? Mixed messages from the White House. Presidential candidate Donald Trump said he supports NATO, but also claimed that the alliance is obsolete. Now President Trump favors better relations with Russia. That does not appear to be good news for Ukraine, where fighting has flared recently between government troops and Russian-backed separatists. Europe is under increasing pressure to demonstrate unity. Germany is working to improve strained relations with Poland. Earlier this month, Chancellor Merkel met Prime Minister Beata Szydło in Warsaw to try to patch things up. Are President Trump's policies a wake-up call for Europe?
So Matthew Karnitschnig, that report asks how much U.S. support Eastern European countries can count on. But the fact is, the statement that we heard just before that from Defense Secretary Mattis, he mentioned strong support. That doesn't sound like a wholesale rejection of NATO.
Not at all, but this is part of the problem. You have Mattis coming over and talking about how NATO is his second home. Yes, the Europeans should pay more, but the U.S. has been saying that actually for many years, for decades, really. But nobody knows, whom they should believe now. Should they believe Mattis? What is Tillerson saying? You've got Flynn out there who's now gone, forced to resign, who seemed to take a somewhat different position and was cozying up to Moscow. So as this conference gets underway here in Munich, there are all of these open questions that they're not going to be able to answer there, because one key question is who's going to replace Flynn as national security advisor, because no matter how much the defense secretary and the Secretary of State support these international alliances like NATO, it really comes down to the president and the White House, what their position is, and that's why the national security advisor is such a key person in that.
Malte Lehming, Defense Secretary Mattis does, at any rate, appear to be imposing more concrete conditions on U.S. participation. He is reported to have told the European members of NATO that they have until the end of this year to come up with a plan for how they are really going to realize that 2% of GDP target that has actually been talked about for a long time but never implemented. So the German government is saying all the right things now. The question is, will it follow through in practice? As I said, the target's been out there for a long time, and it hasn't been met.
The 2% target is out there for a long time, and it hasn't been met. I think Germany is right now paying 1.2% of its GDP. So there are different models now in the background that will be discussed in Munich, as far as I know. There is, for example, the model of saying, let's pay 3% of the GDP, including development aid and all these things, because in a wider definition of security, this contributes to worldwide security. Then you can put some development money and so on and all in this package to try to please that. I think that the main aim of President Trump is that the Europeans are paying more for that. And I think maybe with some rights he can claim that. The big question is what role is foreign policy per se playing into his agenda? Is it on the forefront of his agenda? NATO, security questions with Russia, with the Ukraine, with Transatlantic, or wasn't he elected by and large as well as a kind of isolationist? America first, let's repair the infrastructure and these things of things. And he thinks this is his main agenda and not foreign policy.
I want to come back to just that point, but let me ask you, Shi Ming. We just heard Matthew Karnitschnig say a moment ago that clearly the Defense Secretary and the Secretary of State are at pains to try to counteract some of the more unconventional statements that Donald Trump has made. On the other hand, this very unpredictability, does it perhaps also act as an invitation to rivals and rascals, like North Korea, for example, who then set out to test Donald Trump's limits?
Sure. We see many tests also from Iran, from North Korea, from Taiwan, and even from China in a much weaker pose. But the crucial thing from the point of view of current Chinese government is what role is the United States under Trump is going to play within the NATO? Is to continue the leading role. That means determining strategy. And even until this point is cleared, it is possible to predict what kind of roles all other partners are going to play. If it is not clarified, if Donald Trump's government is just offering some a la carte services, and you need this part and you need this part, you pay for that, just like for Japan or Korea, then it is totally another game to play. And the first fear of the Chinese government is a repeating new Cold War structure, that the United States will holding the leading role, determining this strategy, and all the European countries, because they are too weak, have to follow the United States. Then it is a military bloc, as we know from the time of the Cold War. The second fear is that the Asian part of U.S. strategy could be copied in accordance to the new NATO line. That means that Japan, for example, would take over some similar part like Germany within the NATO structure in Europe or Great Britain. And South Korea will play the part of France, Australia maybe in another part, India is waiting for an invitation. And unless we get a little bit more clarity about all this point, we won't know how the United States, how the administration under Trump is going to take on the Europe, take on the Russia, and take on China.
So I want to get to China in just a moment, but one brief question still on the point of isolationism, because indeed that is Donald Trump's inclination. So let's take a hypothetical case, worst case scenario. Little green men, undercover Russian inspired agents in the Baltics. Would the U.S. put boots on the ground for the Baltics?
I think they would, and I think that there's more continuity maybe in these policies coming out of Washington now than people realize, because if you remember when Obama came into office, there was great concern in Europe that there was going to be this pivot to Asia, and Obama was going to be the Pacific president and so on, and then you had the crisis in Ukraine, and you had other crises, smaller incidents in Europe, and the U.S. and the Obama administration were forced to reorient themselves a bit. At the same time, they really relied heavily on Germany to manage that crisis. So I think that the headline here is that the U.S. wants to remain engaged in Europe. I don't believe this isolationist rhetoric. I think they want to remain engaged, but I think that they want Europe to take care of itself. They trust Europe to take care of itself precisely because they're more worried about China right now, and they feel that they really need to spend more resources there. So I think that is what's going on here. Unfortunately, Trump's tone and the way that he sort of delivers these messages, are often counterproductive, quite frankly.
So,
and there are circles, maybe I can add that for a very short there are circles in the Republican Party that are so strictly, I mean, they want NATO to be function, and they would send boots on the ground. And he relies on these circles that are very foreign policy orientated.
So let us now pivot to Asia ourselves. Mixed signals on Asia as well. Even before he took office, President Trump sparked alarm about whether he might reset America's long-standing one China policy in favor of Taiwan. And his chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has gone so far as to posit an inevitable war in the South China Sea. Let's take a look.
The U.S. and China, a show of force in the South China Sea. The region is rich in natural resources, including petroleum and natural gas, and it's home to major international shipping lanes. Beijing recently began setting up what appear to be military outposts on coral reefs in the area to back its territorial claims. Japan and South Korean forces went on alert last month after Chinese military vessels sailed too close to their borders. The U.S. is concerned about China's growing military and economic power. President Trump has accused China of devaluing its currency and has threatened to impose significant tariffs on Chinese imports. Last month, the president pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, known as TTIP. Mr. Trump wants to make individual trade deals with other countries himself. How dangerous are these disputes between the U.S. and China?
Shi Ming, what is more likely? A shooting war over the South China Sea, a trade war, or is it all just a bunch of hot air?
I, for my part, suppose that none of this would happen. Instead, there will be countless agonizing quarrels because the Chinese government is not ready for such a showdown. We see that the Chinese interpreters, encouraged by the government, are now making great offers to Trump, even though Trump has declared China clearly to the main enemy. Alibaba is offering 1 million jobs within the next 5 years within the United States, and all other Chinese companies are rushing to the United States and say, we make your country great again. We Chinese are making U.S. great again. And this provocation because of Taiwan is not replied very harshly by Chinese government. Chinese spokesman call it just a mistake. It's not a criminal act. This is not a provocation, just a mistake. You should not continue. And I think even in terms of the trade, there are some signs encouraging Chinese government, supposing that the U.S. government is not going to go that far, because Trump is now combining China with Japan, with Europe as three partners who are harming the United States by the same means, by manipulating the exchange rate. The fear of Beijing was that Beijing would be singled out as the main and sole enemy to be fought against. But now the United States is facing three very strong trading partners. If they treat the one partner very harsh and the other not, it is not so convincing, and the whole economy is connected much more closely than Trump could do anything just separated from other actions.
Ironically, however, by virtue of the fact that he left the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, Donald Trump, if anything, has pushed some of the U.S. allies in the region into the arms of China and thereby perhaps made China's position stronger. Matthew Karnitschnig, and I have to ask for you a brief answer, but isn't this the area where Trump's supporters are most expecting direct action, namely on trade, on protectionism?
Absolutely. But I think, as we just heard, it's not going to be that easy because the interests of the United States and China are simply too intertwined. So you hear all of this tough talk coming out of Washington, but it's going to be very hard, I think, to produce quick results. And the problem is that, in a lot of respects, he's right about China. He's right about the trade imbalances with other parts of the world, that the U.S. doesn't always get the right deal. But again, as with Europe and security, the problem is the way he transports this message, and it often does more damage than he intends.
Malte Lehming, our title, coming back to that, America First, and whether it's a threat to world order. Is it perhaps the global economic order of open borders, of trade, of immigration that is most threatened by Trump's actions?
I don't know if it's threatened. I think we have to give credit to the main global players beside of the United States. Europe, China, Russia, and all of the leaders right now seem to behave very cautious, very responsible, waiting for real actions, not just words, so not jumping too fast to a conclusion that could fuel all the tensions that we're seeing right now.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.